13 years old killed and cops are baffled. The strange and tragic death of Amber Archuleta. The air was thick. A silence hung so heavy, it felt alive. Amber's room remained untouched. A shrine of posters, books, and scattered memories. The faint scent of lavender still lingered. It was her favorite, always tucked in drawers. Outside, the wind howled softly. A branch tapped against the window. Rhythmic. Persistent. Tap. 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 Detective Calder stood in the doorway. He hadn't stepped inside before. Not like this. He hesitated. Something about the room felt wrong. Amber's parents had begged him to look again, to find what they all had missed. The case was closed. A tragic accident, they said. But Calder felt the pull. Something unseen tugging at him. The floorboards groaned under his weight. Dust floated lazily in the dim light. The room whispered secrets he couldn't hear. His eyes scanned the dresser, the bed, the small desk in the corner. Nothing seemed out of place, yet everything screamed to be noticed. He reached for the journal. It lay open, untouched, on the desk. The pages fluttered as he lifted it. Words were scribbled, chaotic and raw. Amber's handwriting, unmistakable. I hear them at night. They call my name. They laugh, then cry. They watch me sleep. Calder's breath hitched. He flipped the page. A drawing. Black ink spiraled into frantic shapes. Faces stared back at him. Eyes hollow. Mouths twisted into screams. The closet door creaked. He froze. His hand instinctively reached for his sidearm. The door moved slowly, inch by inch. Darkness loomed inside. Who's there? His voice cracked, barely above a whisper. No answer. He took a step closer. Heart pounding. A chill swept over him. His flashlight trembled in his grip. He shone it inside. Empty. Just rows of Amber's clothes. Hangers swayed, as if disturbed. Then he saw it. Scrawled on the inside wall. With a child's trembling hand. I didn't fall. They pushed me. Calder's breath caught in his throat. The words seemed fresh. The ink glistened in the flashlight's beam. His fingers grazed the writing. The paint felt damp. A chill ran down his spine. He stumbled back. His heel caught the edge of the rug. He nearly fell, catching himself on the desk. The journal slid to the floor. Pages fanned out, whispering in the stillness. The room seemed darker now. The lavender scent had changed. It was sour, like something rotting beneath the sweetness. The tapping on the window grew louder. Faster. Tap. 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 Calder whipped his head toward it. The tree branch. But it wasn't the wind. It was still now. A shadow passed behind the curtains. His pulse thundered in his ears. Amber? The name slipped from his lips without thought. No reply. Just the faint creak of the floorboards. Behind him. He turned sharply. The closet door was wide open. But he hadn't touched it. His flashlight flickered, the beam growing dim. Shadows danced on the walls. His reflection in the mirror seemed off. A fraction too slow. The journal on the floor began to close. Pages turned as if caught in a breeze. But the air was still. Deadly still. The door to the room slammed shut. The sound echoed, rattling the window panes. Calder ran to it, pulled at the knob. It didn't budge. Something scraped behind him. Low. Deliberate. A sound like nails on wood. He spun around. The flashlight gave out. The darkness swallowed him whole. In the pitch black, he heard it. A faint giggle. High-pitched. Childlike. But wrong. It echoed, bouncing off the walls. Then a voice. Soft and trembling. I told you. They're still here. Calder's throat tightened. The voice was unmistakable. Amber. But it couldn't be. His flashlight sputtered, casting faint, erratic beams. The shadows in the room twisted unnaturally. Shapes moved where nothing should. I'm sorry, the voice whispered again. So close now. Right behind him. He spun, swinging the dim light in a frantic arc. Nothing. The air grew colder, biting at his skin. His breath came out in visible puffs. The room felt smaller, closing in around him. The walls seemed to shift, bending in the corners of his vision. Something brushed past his arm.
Light.
Fleeting, but ice-cold. "Amber?" Calder called out, his voice cracking. His own echo mocked him, distorted and wrong. The journal slammed shut with a deafening clap. The sound reverberated like a gunshot. Then silence. Thick and suffocating. He tried the door again, yanking with all his strength. Still locked. Behind him, the closet door creaked. A low groan of wood straining. His heart raced, pounding so loud it drowned out his thoughts. The flashlight flickered once more, then stayed dead. Total darkness consumed him. And then, the whispers began. Faint at first. A jumble of voices, overlapping and chaotic. Some cried. Some laughed. Some spoke in broken, garbled sentences. "I didn't mean to. They're watching. Don't turn around." Calder's knees buckled. He gripped the edge of the desk to steady himself. The voices grew louder, circling him like a storm. The lavender scent was gone now, replaced by a foul, metallic stench.
Blood.
The sound of scratching returned. But this time, it came from inside the walls. Deep, clawing movements, desperate and wild. Calder pressed his back to the door, breathing hard. His hand fumbled for his radio, but static hissed through the speaker. A sharp knock came from the window. 3 precise raps. Knock. 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 He didn't dare look. The air shifted, heavy and oppressive. Something was in the room with him. He could feel it. Watching. Waiting. And then, just above a whisper, it spoke again. "You can't leave. They won't let you." Calder's chest tightened. His breath came in shallow gasps. The room felt alive now, pulsing with unseen energy. The walls groaned, as if stretching and contracting. The knock at the window came again. Firmer. More insistent. Knock. 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 "Turn around," the voice coaxed.
Soft.
Almost sweet, but laced with something sinister. His legs refused to move. His back pressed harder against the door. The radio crackled again. This time, a voice emerged. Distorted, barely audible. "Help me." Amber's voice. Desperate. Pleading. His stomach churned. The air tasted metallic now, like copper. The scratching in the walls grew frantic. Splinters rained from the baseboards. Something was clawing its way out. A low hum vibrated through the floor. It grew louder, rattling the desk and dresser. The mirror on the wall trembled. Then, with a deafening crash, it shattered. Glass exploded outward, shards spinning like stars. Calder shielded his face, feeling tiny cuts burn across his arms. When he lowered his hands, he saw them. Reflections in the fractured glass. Dozens of faces. All staring. Wide-eyed and hollow. Mouths moving in silent screams. The desk drawer slid open on its own. Slow. Deliberate. Like those who had come before him. Fingers that reached for the same empty horizon. He could feel them around him. All of them, pushing closer. Their hollow eyes locked on his, waiting. Always waiting. "Join us, Calder." Amber's voice echoed once more, but this time it was a command. No longer a plea. Her words were the final anchor, pulling him further into the void. He tried to fight, to break free, but it was useless. The darkness was a living thing, suffocating him, devouring him. And slowly, his thoughts began to fade. His sense of self disappeared. All that was left was the endless void and the voices, now silent, waiting for the next soul to be lost, to become another face, another whisper in the dark. And just like that, Calder was no more. Only the abyss remained. The abyss stretched on, infinite and all-consuming. No boundaries, no edges, only darkness. A void that seemed to pulse with life, a constant, rhythmic thrum deep within. It was alive. But Calder was not.
He was a part of it now.
No longer a man. No longer a name. Just another fragment of the darkness that encased him. The faces around him were endless. They flickered, dissolving and reappearing, like broken reflections in shattered glass. He could feel them all, each one of them, minds intertwined, lost souls mingling in the unending cold. A silent cry echoed in the far reaches of his consciousness. But there was no sound, only a presence that filled the space, thick and heavy. There were no memories left, no past, nothing but the endless, suffocating here. And yet, as the moments passed, there was something new, a shift in the stillness, a new face, one he did not recognize. It moved closer, its eyes wide and frantic, filled with fear. The new face trembled, reaching out into the emptiness, desperate to escape. But there was no escape. Calder felt a flicker of something. A memory?
No.
A thought. He was not sure. But it didn't matter anymore. He felt a connection to the new face, a pull, an unspoken understanding. It was happening again. Another soul was being absorbed. Another voice was being silenced. Another body would join the ranks of the lost. And Calder, now a part of the abyss, knew. This was how it always went. This was the endless cycle. The faces would continue to fade in, one after another. But none would ever escape. And somewhere, in the ever-growing void, the voices continued to whisper. Waiting. Always waiting. The whispers grew louder, but their words were indistinguishable, swirling into a maddening hum. The new face was fading, sinking into the darkness, its eyes growing vacant as it too became part of the endless expanse. Calder could feel it, a strange kind of recognition, as if the process of losing himself was somehow a continuation, a never-ending descent. He no longer knew who he was or who he had been. Only the voices. Only the faces. And now another presence. This one different. It felt new. It was struggling. Fighting. A pulse of energy, faint but distinct, throbbed through the dark. This one wasn't like the others. It was alive, in a way the others had stopped being. The hum shifted, becoming more erratic, more urgent. Calder felt something stir deep within him, an awareness, a flicker of hope, or perhaps fear. Was it his fear?
No.
It was theirs. The new face, no, it wasn't just a face anymore. It was a force. A soul that fought against the endless tide of the abyss. It screamed. But the scream was muted, swallowed by the void. And yet, it echoed, shaking Calder's very essence. The faces around him recoiled, drawn back as if repelled. This new force, this new soul, was pushing back. Calder felt himself drawn toward it, not in fear, but in curiosity. There was something familiar about it. Something human. The soul wasn't consumed. It fought, clawed, and screamed louder than any before it. And for a fleeting moment, Calder wondered if this was his chance. A chance to fight. A chance to escape. But the abyss answered. A thick, suffocating silence fell over them. The struggling soul was silenced. The voices fell quiet. The hum stopped. And Calder felt a sharp coldness, like 1,000 icy fingers, piercing through the stillness. It was the darkness reacting. Calder had never felt anything like it before. The presence, the fight, was extinguished, and the abyss stretched deeper, deeper than before. Calder could feel it. This was their fate. There was no escape. Only the abyss, waiting for the next, waiting for more to be swallowed whole. The silence was unbearable now. It stretched on endlessly, pressing down like a heavy weight. The coldness deepened, seeping into Calder's very core. Every part of him was numb, his thoughts sluggish, as if he were fading even more with every passing second. The faces around him had disappeared, swallowed by the vast emptiness. He was alone, alone in the dark. But then, through the crushing silence, a faint noise pierced through. A whisper. It was so faint that it could have been a trick of his mind, but it was there. A voice. His voice. The voice of the soul that had fought. But it wasn't asking for help anymore. It was waiting. Waiting for something Calder couldn't understand. A shiver ran through him, And for the first time, in what felt like an eternity, a flicker of dread ignited in his chest. Was this what it had become for him? Had he too become a whisper in the dark, endlessly waiting for the next to fall into the void? The thought felt foreign, but it settled into his mind like a seed taking root. And then, a cold truth began to surface. The abyss was not just a place. It was a state. It was the culmination of every lost soul, every broken fragment, each one drawn deeper until they became nothing more than a whisper. And Calder understood. He had not escaped. He would never escape. He had become a part of it now. A part of the endless hunger. And the abyss was waiting. Waiting for more. Waiting for others like him. The new presence had struggled, had screamed, but now it too was gone. Lost to the dark. And with that, Calder felt a final shift within himself. The weight of eternity settled into him, pulling him down into the endless night. There was nothing left. Just the waiting. The never-ending whispering. The faces. And the hunger that would never be satisfied. The darkness stretched on, never-ending. No time. No light. No sense of beginning or end. Inside, something gleamed in the faint light. A photograph. He reached for it with trembling fingers. The edges were worn. The image faded. Amber, standing in front of the house. Her smile was forced, her eyes wide with fear. Behind her, a shadow loomed.
Tall.
Distorted. Unmistakably human, but wrong in every way. It stretched unnaturally, its head tilting as if acknowledging him. The hum stopped. Silence returned, heavier than before. The closet door slammed shut. The walls stopped scratching. The tapping on the window ceased. For a moment, Calder thought it was over. Then, the voice came again, right in his ear. "You're next." A hand gripped his shoulder, icy and strong. The room plunged into blackness. Calder's heart pounded in his chest, each beat deafening. The grip on his shoulder tightened.
Cold.
Bitter. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. A presence pressed against him, so heavy it felt like the weight of the room itself. The air grew thick, suffocating. He gasped for breath, but it was as if the oxygen had vanished. The hand on his shoulder slid down his arm, nails scraping against his skin. Chill shot through him, freezing him to the bone. Then with sudden force the grip released. He stumbled forward, his legs weak, unable to support him. The room spun. He braced himself against the wall, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The whispers returned, low and insistent. 1,000 voices, echoing in his mind. "I told you, Amber was only the beginning. They won't let you go." His eyes darted around the room, desperate for any source of light, any escape. But the darkness was absolute. He could no longer feel the walls, the floor beneath his feet. He was floating, trapped in a suffocating void. The whispers grew louder, closer, a soft breath against his ear. Then, a voice calm and chilling. "Welcome to the family." Suddenly, everything stopped. No voices. No sounds. Just a ringing silence. Calder's breath steadied, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, waiting. From the corner of his eye, he saw it. A shadow, tall and thin. Looming. It was the same shadow from the photograph. The one behind Amber. It reached out, fingers long and clawed. The moment before it touched him, Calder was thrown back. The walls crashed inward. The window shattered with an explosion of light. And everything went black. Calder's senses exploded in chaos. His body slammed against something hard. Concrete.
Cold.
The air was thick, stale with a scent of decay. He opened his eyes, blinking against the darkness. Where was he? His mind was foggy, struggling to make sense of the disorienting silence. The only sound was the rush of his own blood in his ears. The shadows seemed to cling to him, moving in unnatural ways. He pushed himself up, his body aching, bruised. Around him, nothing looked familiar. There were no walls, no windows, no doors. Just an endless expanse of black. The ground beneath him was slick, wet. The stench of something foul filled the air, overpowering. He gasped, choking on the thick, rancid air. Suddenly, a faint light flickered in the distance.
It was dim, small.
Like a candle struggling to stay alive. Without thinking, he stumbled toward it. Each step felt heavier than the last. The ground seemed to shift beneath him, unstable. With every move, the darkness around him grew thicker, pressing closer. The light was getting brighter. But as he neared, it dimmed again, flickered. The shape of a figure emerged in the fading glow. A silhouette, a familiar face. Amber. Her eyes were wide, locked on him, but empty. Her mouth was open, as if calling for help, but no sound came out. He reached for her. "Amber," he cried, his voice hoarse. His fingers brushed against her, but she was cold, colder than anything he had ever felt. Her body felt like stone, lifeless. The light flickered once more, casting a harsh shadow across her face. And then her eyes snapped open. Empty, black as night. A smile curled on her lips. A twisted, unsettling smile. "It's your turn," she whispered, her voice a distorted echo. Suddenly, the ground beneath Calder cracked open, splitting apart. He screamed, falling into the abyss. The darkness swallowed him whole. And then nothing. Calder fell, tumbling through the void. The world around him blurred into a swirl of blackness. The air was cold, freezing. His body twisted and turned in the emptiness, no ground to land on. His screams echoed, but they were swallowed, fading away before they could reach his own ears. He felt weightless, like he was falling through an endless night. There was no sound, no light, just a crushing silence. Then, without warning, his fall abruptly stopped. He slammed into something solid, but soft. A floor? He gasped for air, his chest tight. The air was thick here, suffocating, filled with a smell he couldn't place. It was familiar, but wrong. He opened his eyes, blinking against the dark. It was dim, like a fading twilight. A soft glow from nowhere, barely enough to see. He was in a room, but it wasn't a room. The walls were alive, shifting. They seemed to breathe, pulsating slowly, as if they were part of something much larger. The floor beneath him rippled like water, undulating with every movement. And then he saw them. Figures, shadows of people. They stood motionless, their faces twisted in expressions of agony. Amber was among them, her eyes now wide and empty, locked onto his. Her mouth opened again, but no sound came. She reached out, her hand trembling. But it was not her that he felt. It was them, the others. The ones behind her. They were everywhere. Tens. Hundreds. All with eyes filled with sorrow and rage. Their hands reached out to him, clawing at the space between them. "Welcome." The voice came from nowhere. 1,000 voices blending into one, smooth and cold. Calder's heart raced, his body shaking. There was no escape. Every direction led to them. The darkness pressed in from every side. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't move. The shadows closed in. He could feel their fingers brushing against his skin. Their cold, clammy touch sending a jolt of terror through him. Then he felt it. A hand on his shoulder. Familiar. Cold. It spun him around. He met the hollow, soulless eyes of Amber once more. Her smile grew wider. And then, in a voice that was both hers and not hers, she whispered, "You're one of us now." The world around him went black again. Calder's body jerked violently, as if waking from a nightmare. But his eyes stayed closed. He could still feel the cold, the heavy weight of the shadows pressing down on him. The suffocating silence was all around him. His skin tingled, as if touched by 1,000 invisible hands. Then, slowly, his eyelids fluttered open. But there was no light, no room, no air, only darkness. He was no longer falling, no longer floating. He was suspended, hanging in a void. The ground beneath him felt far away, as though he were weightless. Yet he could feel a presence, a strange pull beneath him. It tugged at his insides, gnawing at his very soul. He tried to move, but his limbs felt like lead. Frozen.
Numb.
Every part of him felt detached, like he wasn't fully there. Something whispered in the distance. But it wasn't a voice he could understand. It was a noise, a low hum vibrating through his bones. The hum grew louder, closer, and then he saw it. A flicker. A faint, unnatural light. It grew brighter, pulsing rhythmically, drawing him in. He tried to resist, but his body betrayed him. He was drawn toward it against his will. The light flashed. And then there she was. Amber. But she wasn't the same. Her eyes were black, empty. Her skin pale and stretched thin. Her mouth was open wide in an unnatural smile. Her fingers reached toward him. He wanted to scream, to run, but his voice was gone. The light flickered again, and then nothing. A deep, echoing silence. The pull beneath him was gone. Everything was still. He could feel the weight of the darkness closing in, suffocating him once more. And then, a cold voice whispered in his ear. "We're waiting." The darkness consumed him completely. Calder's mind scrambled, fighting against the suffocating pull of the darkness. But the weight of it was too much. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. His heart thudded violently in his chest, but it sounded distant, muted. The silence was consuming him, wrapping around him like chains. And then, as if from the deepest recesses of his mind, a low, guttural growl broke the stillness. It came from all around him, not from a single voice, but from the shadows themselves. The growl vibrated in his bones, sending waves of dread through his entire body. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came. The darkness seemed to tighten, to crawl deeper into him, filling every inch of his being. He could feel it. Something was moving within him, slithering, twisting. Something not his own. The pressure was unbearable. His lungs burned as he struggled to fill them with air, but it was as if the very atmosphere had turned to stone. The growl came again, louder, closer, until it was right behind him. A cold breath brushed the back of his neck.
He didn't dare turn.
The whispering voices from before began again, louder this time, their words indistinguishable, but filled with malice. Then, Amber's voice cut through the chaos. Her voice, but not her. It was empty, hollow. "It's too late," she said softly. Her voice echoed in his mind, like a fading memory, but her presence was all around him now. The sensation of her cold fingers brushing against his skin made him flinch. "You belong here," she whispered. "You always have." He felt it then, the unbearable weight of her words, sinking into him, infecting his soul. The world around him twisted and fractured. The shadows pulled away, revealing nothing but a vast, endless expanse. The faces, hundreds of them, eyes wide open, staring at him with hollow expressions. They were all there, and they were waiting for him to join them, to become one of them. Calder's mind cracked, the last remnants of his resistance shattering. And then, with one final exhale, he surrendered. The darkness took him completely. He was no longer Calder. He was just another face. Another voice in the endless abyss. The void swallowed him whole. No longer a man, no longer a name. He was just another shadow, another piece of the darkness. The faces around him blurred, merging with his own. Their cold, hollow eyes stared into nothing, lost in the same eternity. He could feel them now, all of them. Not just the ones who had come before him, but the ones who would follow. He was part of something far greater than himself. An endless, shifting mass of souls, bound together in this cold, suffocating abyss. There was no escape. There was no end.
He was trapped.
A whisper brushed against his mind. "Welcome." The voice was different this time. It was soft, gentle, but laced with something far darker. He felt it, an overwhelming sense of finality. The darkness around him seemed to pulse with life, swirling and stretching, as though it could consume everything. There was no air, no ground, only a sea of faces, each one staring, waiting, lost. They were all the same now. He was one of them. An empty shell, stripped of everything that had once been human. And yet there was something else. A flicker of light, distant and faint, far beyond the reach of his senses. A fleeting hope, but it was quickly smothered by the heavy, oppressive force around him. The faces reached out to him, their hands like ice, pulling him further into the dark. One voice rose above the others. Amber's voice.
Soft.
Unmistakable. Join us, Calder. We are all here. We are all waiting. Her words echoed, reverberating in the endless void. And he knew, without a doubt, that there was no turning back. He had become part of this nightmare. Forever. In the dark. He was no longer Calder. He was nothing. Just another face in the endless, eternal abyss. The darkness around him thickened, pressing in from all sides. It wrapped around him like chains, squeezing tighter with each passing second. His senses, now completely numb, could no longer distinguish between time and space. The faces around him were no longer just faces. They were him.
And he was them.
Endlessly shifting, merging, becoming indistinguishable from the rest. Amber's voice drifted closer, yet it felt farther away than ever. She was everywhere in everything. "You're one of us," she whispered again, the words carrying the weight of an eternity. Each syllable sank deeper into him, replacing his thoughts, his memories. There was no escape from her. No escape from the endless hunger of the darkness. No escape from the voices. The endless whispering. The silent screams of countless souls who had become one with the abyss. He reached out, but his hands were no longer his own. They were cold, pale, disjointed. Calder's mind, now hollow, drifted further away from himself. He felt the emptiness inside, a deep void that mirrored the one surrounding him. It was all-consuming, all-powerful. And the waiting, the endless waiting, it was not just his own. It was shared. Each face that had entered, each soul that had fallen, now waited, too. They were all here, all lost. But they weren't gone. They existed in this space, this purgatory. Not dead, not alive, but waiting. For something. For someone.
But what?
Calder couldn't remember anymore. The whispers grew louder, surrounding him from all sides. Faint echoes of lost souls speaking a language he could no longer understand. But one voice stood out. Amber's. Her whisper was clear, cutting through the fog of forgotten thoughts. "Do you understand now?" The question was simple, but it shook him to his core. He wanted to scream, to fight, but the strength was gone. There was nothing left but the endless tide of emptiness. And yet he heard it again. Amber's voice, still soft but full of something darker.
"You are one of us now."
Forever. Her words were not cruel. They were knowing. And as they echoed in his mind, Calder understood. He wasn't just a victim of the abyss. He was a part of it. A part of something far older, far more eternal than his fleeting existence had ever been. He had crossed a threshold, one that could not be undone. The waiting had no purpose anymore. There was only the abyss. And in it he was lost. One face among many. Waiting. Forever. The abyss was not empty, not silent as it had once seemed. It was alive in ways Calder couldn't comprehend. The whispers were no longer just voices. They were sensations, feelings that washed over him like waves, pulling at his very essence. They weren't just in his mind. They were in his soul. Amber's voice faded, replaced by 1,000 others, all speaking at once, each one carrying a thread of their own despair. It was a chorus of souls, bound to this place, repeating the same words, the same cries. "I am lost. Help me. Why am I here?" But Calder didn't respond.
He didn't know how.
The words had no meaning anymore. The voices were endless, all blending together into one long, uninterrupted hum. Each one familiar and alien at the same time, as if they were echoes of the past and warnings of the future. Calder felt the weight of their collective grief. The suffocating pain of those who had been here far longer than he. He could feel them reach out, brushing against him, tugging at his fading consciousness. but there was nothing left of him to give. He was just another face. Another fragment of this endless sea of lost souls. And then, for a brief moment, he felt something different. A shift. A presence among the others. It was the same as before, a flicker of life, of resistance, of something fighting against the inevitable pull of the abyss. Another soul.
New.
Desperate. Fighting harder than he ever did. But it was futile.
Calder knew it now.
No one escaped. And as he felt the new presence fade, consumed by the dark, Calder realized that his understanding of this place had deepened. There was no release here. There was no salvation. Just the endless waiting. The never-ending pull of the abyss, drawing in soul after soul. They were all lost. And he was just one more to join the endless cycle. The whispers continued, but Calder couldn't hear them anymore.
He didn't need to.
He had become part of them. Part of the waiting. Forever. The endless hum filled the void, a low, vibrating pulse that reverberated through Calder's very being. It wasn't music or sound. It was the fabric of existence itself, woven into every fiber of his being. It was the heartbeat of the abyss.
And he was a part of it now.
The faces, the souls, all around him, flickering in and out like dim stars in an infinite night.
They were the same as him now.
They were him. Each one was a thread in the dark tapestry, each one lost in the weight of eternity. And as Calder sank deeper into the void, he felt the pull again, not just of the abyss, but of something else, something older, more powerful. It was the presence of something that had been here far longer than the souls surrounding him. Something ancient. And it was watching him. The air around him thickened, as though the very essence of the abyss was holding its breath. He could feel it closing in, like something had stirred, something waiting for him. But the instant he focused on it, the feeling slipped away, just as quickly as it had come. The waiting, the hum, everything fell back into place, as though nothing had shifted at all. And yet, something deep inside Calder had changed. He could feel it in the silence, in the shadows that stretched endlessly beyond his reach. He was no longer just drifting. He was waiting too. Waiting for the next soul to arrive, to be swallowed whole by the dark. Waiting to see if they would fight, if they would struggle like he had. Waiting to see who would be next. The abyss was infinite, stretching beyond comprehension. It was a cycle, one that would never end. And Calder understood it now. It wasn't just the souls that were lost. It was the waiting. And that was the true eternity. Forever suspended. Forever lost. Forever waiting. The waiting was the only constant. It stretched on without end, timeless, relentless. Calder could feel it seep into his very soul, filling the void where his thoughts once were. He was no longer just a part of the abyss. He had become the abyss itself. The whispers, the faces, the lost souls, they weren't separate from him anymore. They were one.
He was them.
They were him. And yet, in that shared darkness, he felt something stir again. A flicker of recognition. A sharp, unfamiliar feeling rising from the depths of his fractured consciousness. A thought. A question. Who would come next? He no longer knew how long it had been since he had first arrived in this place, but that question gnawed at him. He had forgotten everything else, his name, his past, the world he had once known. But he remembered this, the endless cycle. The next one would come, and they would be lost just as he had been. Calder could feel it seep into his very soul, filling the void where his thoughts once were. He was no longer just a part of the abyss. He had become the abyss itself. The whispers, the faces, the lost souls, they weren't separate from him anymore. They were one. He was them. They were him. And yet, in that shared darkness, he felt something stir again. A flicker of recognition. A sharp, unfamiliar feeling rising from the depths of his fractured consciousness. A thought. A question. Who would come next? He no longer knew how long it had been since he had first arrived in this place, but that question gnawed at him. He had forgotten everything else, his name, his past, the world he had once known. But he remembered this, the endless cycle. The next one would come, and they would be lost just as he had been. There was no way out. And as the new soul's resistance crumbled, it too began to fade into the endless void. No screams, no sound, just a slow, inevitable sinking into the dark. The new presence was swallowed whole. Another lost, another waiting. Calder's thoughts had become nothing more than echoes now. He was part of the abyss, but the abyss was beyond him. It was beyond everything. The waiting stretched on, never changing, never ending. There was no light, no escape, only the hum of the abyss, the pulse of lost souls. And then, as the dark settled back into its familiar rhythm, Calder understood something else. It wasn't just the souls who were lost. It was the abyss itself. The waiting wasn't just a punishment. It was the curse. For even the abyss, in all its infinite power, was trapped in its own endless cycle. It could never stop. It could never end. And neither could the waiting. Forever. 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 The weight of eternity pressed harder on Calder. The abyss, though vast, felt tighter now. The hum was louder, more oppressive, as if it too was suffocating beneath its own endless cycle. And Calder realized that the waiting wasn't just for new souls. It was for something else. Something even the abyss could never have anticipated. He could feel it now, deep within the dark, within the very pulse of this forsaken place.
A shift.
A movement. Something that had been waiting longer than even the lost souls, longer than the abyss itself. It wasn't a presence. It was a feeling, a coldness that radiated from the deepest corners of the void, wrapping around Calder's very core. A presence that he couldn't fully grasp, but one that he could feel coming closer. And it wasn't like the others. It wasn't a soul. It was something older. Something that had been here far before the first soul was lost to the abyss. The hum shifted again, its rhythm changing, slowing. The faces around him began to flicker more erratically, as though something had disturbed the already unstable equilibrium of the void. Calder tried to focus, but there was nothing to focus on. Just the endless dark and the pulse that grew louder, quicker, more desperate. And then the voice. Not a whisper, not a whispering soul, but something deeper. Something ancient. The voice didn't speak to Calder. It spoke to the void itself. To the abyss. "You think you can escape the cycle?" it said. The words rang out with a power that Calder felt to his very soul. The abyss trembled. For the first time since he had arrived, it felt as though the void itself was afraid. The coldness grew colder, spreading like ice through his veins. And Calder, no longer human, no longer just a face among many, could feel it. The abyss wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The waiting would continue, but now, it was a waiting for something much more dreadful. Not for souls. Not for the lost. But for something else. Something that was coming. And it would be the end of everything. The pulse quickened, like the heartbeat of something monstrous, thrumming in the deep, dark spaces of the void. Calder could feel it, the shift in the very fabric of the abyss. It was as though the void was alive, and whatever had awakened within it was stretching, reaching toward him. He had been waiting for so long. He had forgotten what waiting felt like. But now, in the depths of the dark, he felt it. The presence, older than the abyss itself. A force that seemed to ripple through the very air, bending the silence into something tangible, something that threatened to crush him. It wasn't a soul. It wasn't a lost voice. It was the true nature of the abyss. The thing that had been here before any soul had ever crossed its threshold. The thing that had waited long before the first whispers echoed in the dark. The coldness enveloped Calder, suffocating, pulling him into a deeper understanding of his place here. He wasn't just a part of the abyss anymore. He was its messenger, its prisoner. The whispers grew louder, but not with the voices of the lost. They were different. They were the murmurs of something ancient, something forever tied to the darkness, something that had known this waiting longer than anyone. And as the coldness closed in tighter around him, Calder realized the truth. The waiting was not just for the souls. It was for the return of the abyss itself. For whatever this was, whatever force was awakening, it was about to rise. And when it did, there would be nothing left. The abyss would consume itself. It would swallow every face, every whisper, and Calder would no longer be a part of it. He would be lost. Nothing more than a memory, a fleeting moment in the endless cycle. The waiting would end, but in its place, something darker would emerge. Something that could never be forgotten. And as the coldness intensified, Calder felt a final shift. The abyss was no longer just a place. It was a creature, and it was ready to feed. The air thickened, pressing in on Calder from all sides. He could feel the weight of it now, a suffocating pressure that grew heavier with every passing second. It was as if the abyss itself had become aware of his existence. And it was hungry. The ancient presence that had stirred deep within the void was no longer just a distant whisper. It was here. It was inside him, curling around his very essence, pulling at the remnants of his identity. There was no escape, no way to resist. The coldness gripped tighter, 1,000 icy tendrils wrapping around him, squeezing the very breath from his existence. He felt his thoughts unraveling, pieces of himself slipping away like sand through his fingers. The whispers, those countless voices, faded. They became nothing more than a distant hum, a faint vibration beneath the overwhelming presence of the abyss. And then, with a sudden, violent shudder, Calder understood. The abyss was not just a prison. It was a cycle, a process, a devouring force, endlessly consuming, only to be reborn and repeat itself. It didn't hunger for souls alone. It hungered for something deeper, something more primal. It fed on the very existence of those it claimed. And as Calder's sense of self began to dissolve into the darkness, he realized that he was not just waiting. He had become the waiting. He was part of the cycle now, part of the hunger that would never be sated. And it was starting again. The presence was reaching outward, drawing in the next soul to feed upon. Calder could feel the shift, the sudden pull as something new arrived. Another lost one. Another soul to join the endless chain. It was the same over and over. The abyss would never stop. It would never end. And now, Calder's fate was sealed. He was no longer just a face in the dark. He was the abyss. Waiting. Forever. The abyss trembled, vibrating with the hunger of a force that knew no end. Calder, now a mere fragment of what he once was, could feel the new soul approaching, drawn inexorably toward the same fate he had suffered. He couldn't see it, but he could feel its fear, its resistance. It fought, just as he had, just as all the others had. But it was hopeless. The cycle was unbreakable. Calder felt its presence draw closer, the whispers of the new soul fading into the hum of the abyss. They were merging now, the two souls, one ancient, one new, intertwining in the cold, dark void. And as the new soul passed him by, Calder could hear the soft, desperate cry that echoed from it, much like his own had. But there was no answer. Only silence. Only waiting. The abyss was growing louder now, its presence surrounding him, pulsing with an energy that was older than time itself. He wasn't just part of it anymore. He was entangled in it, bound to it in a way he couldn't escape. It was more than a prison. It was a force, an all-consuming hunger. And Calder understood now that there was no escape, not for him or for the others. This was the beginning and the end. The cycle would never stop, never give mercy. He was bound to it, just as all the lost souls were bound. There was only waiting. And when the waiting ended, when the abyss could no longer hold its hunger, it would devour everything. Everything. And Calder would be there, lost in the dark, waiting for the next soul to join the endless chain. There was no salvation, no escape. Just the abyss. And the endless, eternal waiting. The hum of the abyss grew louder, its pulse now in sync with Calder's fading heartbeat. He no longer felt like a separate entity, but an extension of the darkness itself. It consumed him, twisted him, and yet he was powerless to fight against it. The cold, unyielding presence wrapped tighter around him, making every thought a distant memory until there was nothing left but the endless waiting. There were no longer faces, no longer whispers, just the dark void, stretching out forever, endlessly repeating. And still, Calder felt the hunger. It was insatiable, gnawing at the edges of his existence, devouring whatever scraps of his identity remained. He wasn't sure how much time had passed, if time even existed here, but the cycle never ceased. New souls continued to fall, one after another, each one flickering for a brief moment before being swallowed whole by the abyss. Their cries echoed in the distance, barely audible through the infinite layers of darkness. They too would become a part of it, lost and forgotten. And in their place, Calder waited. He waited, and he understood now. The abyss was not just a place.
It was a state of being.
A void that absorbed everything, even the concept of escape. And now, Calder had become the waiting itself. He could no longer differentiate between himself and the abyss. There was no longer any him, just an empty space that would never be filled, a hunger that would never be sated. It was the fate of all those who entered. It was the price of the waiting. The abyss wasn't just eternal. It was unyielding, all-consuming, and it would never stop. And as Calder felt the pull of the next soul, another one, struggling, fighting, only to fade into nothing, he knew that there would always be another. Always more waiting. Always more souls. The cycle would never end. And in this endless dark, Calder was nothing but a whisper. A face lost in the waiting. Forever. The abyss had swallowed everything. Time, memories, the very essence of self. Calder no longer remembered who he had been. There was only the void, an unbroken expanse of darkness that stretched beyond the comprehension of anyone who had once known the world outside. The air was thick with the weight of waiting, a weight that pressed down on every inch of existence. There was no longer a need for voices. No need for faces. Just the endless, never-ending pull of the abyss. Calder felt his existence blur into the dark, his thoughts scattering like dust in the wind. He was no longer separate from it.
He was it.
A part of the hunger, a part of the waiting, a part of the infinite. And yet, even in this endless nothingness, he felt something stir again. Something new. A ripple, faint at first, deep within the heart of the abyss. A presence, one that had been waiting, not like the others, but with intent. It was not the frantic struggle of a lost soul trying to resist the inevitable. This was different. This presence moved through the darkness with a calm that Calder had never felt before. And it was coming toward him, closer and closer. He could sense it, its calmness pulling through the chaotic energy of the abyss, like a thread in the dark. But this time there was no fear. There was no resistance. It wasn't like the others. This one knew. It understood. And as it finally reached Calder's consciousness, he felt the shift. The pull of the abyss didn't consume it. It joined it. In that brief moment, Calder realized the truth. The abyss wasn't just a prison for the lost. It was a place for those who knew, those who had accepted the waiting. And as the presence merged with him, Calder no longer felt the hunger. No longer the suffocating pull of endless nothing. Instead, he felt peace, acceptance. The waiting was not a curse. It was a gift. And now, he was no longer waiting. He had become part of the eternal, part of the abyss itself, forever. The abyss had always been endless, but now, in the quiet stillness that stretched infinitely, Calder felt something he hadn't before. A deep, unsettling calm. The overwhelming hunger that once gnawed at his very soul had quieted, and in its place was something different. The waiting. For so long, he had fought against it, resisted its call, his mind desperate for something, anything, that could break the cycle. But now, the waiting felt like a part of him. It wasn't a punishment anymore. It wasn't a prison. It was just the way things were. The truth of the abyss unfolded before him like a door finally opening, and in that space, Calder understood. The waiting was eternal, yes, but it was not without purpose. The souls that passed through, the ones that fought and struggled and screamed, They were not lost. They were reborn. In some unfathomable way, they were the threads that wove the fabric of the abyss. And he was now a part of that fabric. Not just a face in the dark, but an essence woven into the infinite cycle. As the whispers of the lost souls faded, Calder no longer felt the emptiness. He could feel the pulse of the abyss, the rhythm of existence, humming gently through him, connecting him to the endless flow of time and being. It wasn't something to escape from. It wasn't something to fear. It simply was. And in that moment, Calder knew that he would never truly be alone again. He had become one with the abyss, not just a prisoner within it. The cycle would continue. Souls would come. Souls would go. But now, Calder was no longer a spectator. He was part of the waiting. He was part of the eternal. The darkness embraced him fully, not as a force of hunger, but as a force of connection. And as the endless hum of the abyss faded into the deep, Calder closed his eyes, no longer waiting for escape. For he had found his place. Forever.